Well, you're back for another lecture on the nervous system and all its fascinating aspects, which we'll cover in this and a final third module next time. So this time around, we're going to take on the issue of the structure and function of the central and peripheral nervous systems, and our interest in doing so is so that as we go along in the course, we can talk about their relationship to hope. So, this module is delivered to you in 4 parts. In the first, we're going to take an overview of the nervous system as a whole and its basic functions in humans. In the second part, we're going to look at this thing called homeostasis. We mentioned that last time in greater detail. Then we'll get around to a discussion of the central nervous system and its functions in Part 3. And lastly, Part 4 will be devoted to the peripheral nervous system and the limbic system. So let's get started on an overview of the nervous system. So this is information that we're going to be using throughout the course, so I beg you to pay attention and do some thinking, certainly do the reading in the book. And we have an exploratory exercise based on the nervous system, so between those 3 modalities, you ought to be able to be fairly conversant on what you need to know to get through this part of the course. So in the simplest phraseology, the nervous system in humans, as well as upper vertebrates, consists of the brain, the spinal column, and the peripheral nerves. That's as simple as we can possibly make it. The function, of course, is to do what we've been talking about in the last lecture, which is to recognize and coordinate the body's responses to changes in the internal and external environments with the ultimate goal of survival, reproduction, and the perpetuation of the species. So we're going to start with trying to understand the function and the structure of the nervous system, because it is, after all, critical to understanding hope and, by extension, religion. We're going to be particularly interested in looking at key parts of the brain that will be important in these ancillary areas, and also we need to be cognizant of the method by which the neurons and their neurohormones, which we'll take up next time, act to create thoughts, memories, feelings, and all those things that go into an emotional state like hope or belief. It's important to think and to understand that the neurons themselves don't act alone. They're joined together in a very complicated neural network, which we collectively know as the nervous system. But in the human nervous system, as well as other higher vertebrates, the nervous system in toto has 2 major subdivisions, and they are, respectively, the central nervous system, which receives information from sense organs, processes that information, analyzes it, and then formulates and coordinates responses to that information. And then secondly, the peripheral nervous system, which receives information from the environment, relays it to the command center, which is the brain, and the CNS, and then after that to organs and glands that are needed to maintain a homeostatic or steady state in those critical body functions that we talked about last time. So let's now address that issue specifically. What the heck is steady state, and why do we care? Well, sometimes these matters are best understood by taking a simple analogy. And the one that I like is that of body temperature. So if we do an analogy that you're a little bit more familiar with, namely the temperature of your home or your apartment or your dorm room, as the case may be, normally we'd like that temperature to be within a fairly narrow range, namely somewhere between 65 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit. and you have this thing on your wall somewhere called a thermostat that measures the ambient temperature. And when the temperature is too high in the summer, for instance, it kicks on the air conditioner, or if it's in the winter, it turns the furnace off. And conversely, when the temperature is too low, if it's winter, it turns the furnace on. If the summer, it probably won't do anything. But the point is, there's an active device for measuring the temperature in the home and taking appropriate remedial steps when it's not in that 65 to 75 degree range. So your body does roughly the same thing. You have an optimal temperature range for your body that's 98.6 or thereabouts. And when your body is too hot, your brain reacts by telling the blood to circulate more rapidly through the skin. That produces sweat on the epidermis, your skin. And the sweat will then proceed to evaporate, and that evaporation draws heat out of your body and reduces your core body temperature. You can also do this passively in humans and other animals, namely, if you get too hot, you may not sweat, but you could just walk to the shade and sit down and have a cool drink, and that will also reduce your body temperature. So you have several mechanisms for adjusting your body temperature if your temperature is too high. You also have both passive and active ways of cooling your body. One way of doing it passively is to put on a sweater or go into a place where it's heated. But you also have an interesting mechanism for doing this, which is active in nature, and that is when you are cold, your body does something biochemically, internally, that productively or collectively produces heat, and that is that your body simultaneously creates the sugar called glucose in a process known as gluconeogenesis, and it simultaneously breaks that glucose down in a process called glycolysis. And the combination of the two things results in heat. And the visible sign that your body is doing this is the chattering of your teeth and the shivering that you undergo in a process known as futile cycling. Those biochemists like to name things interesting things, and they call shivering and the underlying biochemistry futile cycling. But the point is, your body has these mechanisms that are both passive and active to maintain your body temperature at the desired level, so that the other things in your body which depend on having that temperature operating can do their thing as well. All right, so we're going to be seeing this picture a couple of times. At this moment, what I want to point out to you, if I can find my little thing over here, where's my pen? Come back, red pen, come back. Okay, so the central nervous system consists of two elements, the brain, which I'm drawing a line around now, and the spinal column. So that is the central nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is just about everything else. So the peripheral nerves go from either your brain or your spinal cord to various things out in the body, your arms and legs, your chest, your abdomen, all of these nerves that project out and away from the central nervous system are part of your peripheral nervous system. So here's a more nuanced view of those two things. We, of course, have the central nervous system with the brain and the spinal column, in this case, shaded for you in a nice shade of pink so you can tell them apart from the peripheral nerves, which in this case appear for you thoughtfully in blue. All right, now let's take up the structure and the function of the central nervous system, of which we're going to be concerned with the brain and the spinal cord, as previously mentioned. Now, these elements are so important to you that they are protected by a variety of highly specialized, highly evolved things. For instance, both the brain and the spinal column are protected by bones. The skull is housed and protected by the skull, and the vertebral column is the bony structure into which the spinal cord is inserted and gets its protection from. But in addition to that, the brain is wrapped in 3, not 1, but 3 layers of connective tissue, which go by the name meninges. Now, these are very important for keeping your brain in good shape, but I would note that the meninges also cause some rather severe problems as well. For instance, if you get a brain tumor, it's not the gray matter, it's not the brain itself that has cancerous tissues in it, because the brain cells do not divide after your brain is formed as a young person. Rather, it's the meninges which get cancerous cells in them, and sometimes if it's an invasive cancer, the meninges will then invade the brain tissue, and that is what we associate with the term brain cancer. Another thing that can happen is the meninges can get infected, and that results in a brain infection we call encephalitis, which also can be rather dire. So, there is no free lunch. Some things protect you, and they also hurt you under different circumstances. Another thing that's protective in nature is the bones of the central nervous system are bathed in a cerebral spinal fluid in the spaces between the meninges and the brain, also in the spinal cord where the central part of it exists. And this is basically a shock absorber fluid. So you've got the bony part of the brain and spinal column as the first layer of protection. As the second layer of protection, you have the meninges surrounding the brain, and then lastly, you've got the cerebral spinal fluid in the spaces in the central nervous system. So there's lots of protection devoted to your central nervous system because it's so very important to you. Now, of course, we should address the issue of whether or not your brain cells divide. I've just mentioned that once your brain is formed as a young person, the standard thinking was that your brain cells cannot divide after that early part of your life. And that's why, as a young person, you may have heard the admonition from your parents not to drink to excess because that activity can kill your brain cells, and you do not want to be killing off your brain cells unnecessarily. Yes, it's true that your brain contains about 100 billion neurons, but since at least the traditional thinking was that you were born with all the brain cells you're going to have, you don't want to be getting rid of them for no particularly good reason. Now, it turns out that this particular statement may not be categorically true. There are, it seems, conditions under which brain cells might be induced to divide. And so researchers are actively exploring mechanisms by which this can be induced when we want it to have happened. In the case, for instance, of severing a main neuronal connection. Let's say your leg has an injury and the major nerves in your legs are torn as a result, and wouldn't it be convenient if we could have those regenerated? And so we're looking for ways to encourage having your neurons regenerate themselves, even though the traditional view is that the brain cells at least could not. But there are lots of degenerative diseases, things like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease, where if we could get the brain to regenerate itself, it would be a major step forward in alleviating human suffering. Again, our picture of the nervous system. On the left, we see the whole darn thing, but over here, we see the relevant parts of the central nervous system excised for easy access. So again, we're talking about the brain and the spinal column as the key elements in the central nervous system. Now, let me make a few more comments about the brain because it is so freaking important. It's basically just a whole bunch of neurons. So we've been talking about neurons, and that's what the brain is, this amalgamation, this huge collection of neurons in one place. And that's why we call the human brain both centralized and cephalized. All told, your brain weighs about 3.5 pounds. It's surrounded by these things called glial cells, which are important in a protective way and also for communication of one neuron to the next. Another thing that helps the skull stay where it is attached are some small ligaments that extend from the skull into the other bony architecture that's in the body. And this is something that's very important to humans because we have this upright posture and we've got this 3.5 pound orb that's sitting on top of the tip of our spine. And that's a really unstable, unprotected situation. So this is one of the reasons that you as a human being are very susceptible to things like whiplash. You're on a car, it gets hit, and your head goes flying backwards. And it's often sort of jolted out of place as a result of bad activity. This is why sports like boxing or like football frequently are very bad for your brain because it's sitting on top of this little tiny attachment point. And without further assistance, such as these ligaments, your brain would be very vicarious in its orientation. But again, we're going through all of this because we want to get to the functions that are associated with the brain and the different areas of the brain with which hope and belief are attached. And so let's move on to some of those discussions now. This is a brain, this is the whole brain in side view, but what I want you to focus on, and will be the subject of the next couple of slides particularly, is this area on top, which we call the cerebrum. And in humans, it's the major part of the brain. For the record, you can discern the other elements of the brain here. For instance, I can get my darn pen. Here we have the cerebellum, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and the medulla, which is basically a swelling on top of the spinal cord. But right now we're going to focus on the cerebrum, which is reckoned to be the most prominent part of the brain in humans. Now in other animals it's relatively smaller, but in humans it's gigantic, and we'll talk about why that's important later on in the course. It's divided into different parts. The cerebrum can be divided into the cortex and the neocortex. The neocortex is also known as the forebrain, and it's something that's only found in higher mammals. It's right under your forehead, right under your forehead, and it's sort of an addition that was found late in mammalian evolution. So not every vertebrate has it, but the really advanced ones, such as humans, do. It's very important, the cerebrum is very important because it is the site of our voluntary and conscious action. It's associated with and is considered to be the seat of intelligence, judgment, and learning. Structurally, the cerebrum is split in half. It's divided by a deep groove known as the corpus callosum, and each half of the cerebrum, which falls on either side of the corpus callosum, is called a hemisphere. Now, the corpus callosum is extremely important. It's basically just a bundle of neurons, but it's different from the brain cells. The corpus callosum allows the two hemispheres, the two halves of the cerebrum, to talk to one another. So we'll be revisiting that. Here is a brain in another orientation which has been divided in half. So the two halves of the cerebrum have been separated. Inside, you can see this relatively lighter area. This is the corpus callosum, which, because the whole brain has been severed, has also been cut in half. Now, among the specific things associated with the cerebrum and the cerebral cortex, one of the major functions is the control of sensory and motor activity. So we talked previously about processing input from the sensory organs and then sending out commands to the motor neurons. Well, this is where it all gets done in the cerebrum. Important to us, though, are the facts that this is where this thing called the mind, but nobody can really define it very well, but you know what we are talking about when we use that word, I trust. The mind, also the self-image, your idea about who you are and where your body is and where your influence extends, these things are created there in the cerebrum as well. I already mentioned that the cerebrum is divided into two hemispheres, but I didn't mention previously that the left side of your cerebrum receives and analyzes sensations from the right. This includes the control of motor activity, also language and math, and for that reason, the left half of the brain is sometimes referred to as the analytical brain. On the other hand, the right side of your cerebrum receives and analyzes input from the left side of your body, and its function is to create a holistic, integrated view of yourself, including your visual spatial orientation, where I am in space, also understanding and processing as well as expression of emotion. So this is sometimes known as the emotional brain. But because the two hemispheres, at least under normal circumstances, are connected by the corpus callosum, the information can flow back and forth across the divide between the two hemispheres. Now, as I said, each hemisphere deals mainly with the stuff that comes in from the opposite side of the body. And as I said previously, the right side of the brain is generally associated with creativity and emotion, the left side with analytical, although this is obviously a generalization and one can identify lots of exceptions. Whoops. Okay. Now, the cerebrum is very large, and as a result, for convenience sake, the cerebrum is divided into 4 different lobes, each lobe receiving the name of the skull bone that covers it. So we have the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. And down here you see a series of diagrams which show you those different lobes in position on the cerebrum. And in each of these pictures, the lobe being highlighted gets a unique color. So the frontal lobe is in the front of the brain, not surprisingly, and it's being highlighted in blue. The occipital lobe is in the back of the brain. Now it has sort of a reddish-brown color to make it stand out. The parietal lobe is kind of on the top, but towards the back of the skull, covered by the parietal bone. And the temporal lobe is the last one, and it's situated basically right under your ear. So those are the 4 lobes that we're going to be considering in this course. And we understand that, you don't really want to be a brain scientist, but some of the functions of these different lobes will be relevant to our discussion of hope and belief. So we want you to at least be familiar with the names and kind of have an idea where they are in the brain when we talk to them. We're going to be looking at brain scans later on. So if I say parietal lobe, I would like for you to have an idea that it's some place in the cerebrum and sort of a general idea where it's located. All right, so let's take an example of how the brain, which is to say the cerebrum in this case, does its basic job. So we'll imagine for this illustration that you're listening to a lecture, much like you are right now. And so you're hearing a sound that goes from the source of the sound and enters your ear. And as a consequence, an electrical message will be sent to your brain, courtesy of your auditory nerve. And in the brain, the sound is then going to be sent, because I'm assuming that we're listening to words, the sound will be sent to the main language center, which is in the left hemisphere of the brain. It's in the temporal lobe right under your ear. And for the sake of argument, let's say at one point the lecturer says the word write, which I'm spelling W-R-I-T-E. But at this point, you don't know whether the lecturer means write as in correct, write as in something with a pen, or write like a practice, a religious rite, for instance, until your brain, your left brain, analyzes the context and the syntax. And usually between those two overlays, we can determine what word was meant. If not, we might have to wait for the rest of the sentence to tell us what's going on. But even so, you're still not done, because at this point, even though the temporal lobe on the left side of the brain has intercepted the message and processed it a little bit, now it's going to send the message using the corpus callosum to the secondary language center, which is in the right hemisphere. And the right brain then begins to interpret the emotional aspects of the statement, whatever it is, and any nuances or verbal inflections or tones of voice or levels of the voice. Was it angry? Was the lecturer yelling? Was the person doing the address weepy and morose? Was it typical college professor monotonous? All of these things are possible. But now that both halves of the brain have gone to work on it, a full picture, a full understanding of what the statement was finally comes together. And we know this is how it works because we've done experiments on actual humanoids. And this is something that happened largely as a therapeutic intervention. It turns out that people with bad cases of epilepsy, not so much now where chemical interventions are possible, but in the past, it was deemed necessary to at least partially sever the corpus callosum. In bad cases, they would actually sever the whole thing. And the rationale behind this was that these folks were having such bad epileptic seizures that they were in danger of hurting themselves. So they would separate the corpus callosum to prevent that. And that was okay. It usually did help control the problem. But then other difficulties occur, as you can imagine, if the two halves of the brain can no longer talk to one another. So there were interesting reports coming from physicians of people with a severed corpus callosum. And one guy, for instance, would, after his surgery, he would put on his pants with his left hand and take them off with his right hand. And nobody could figure out why, but it seemed to be a messaging problem in the brain as a result of the severed corpus callosum. The classic experiment with a person with a callicectomy, that's what we call a severing of the corpus callosum, is that if you block the visual field of the individual so that only one eye can see an object, if the left eye sees, for instance, a spoon, and the right eye is not able to see it, but only the left eye sees it, we know that the information from the left eye will be processed on the right side of the brain. And the interesting thing is the person undergoing this test can tell it's a spoon, but he or she can't say it because, recall, the speech comes from the left side of the brain, which is now not getting the information. And so this leads to what we call split brain cognition, which can be both interesting and probably very frustrating at many times because it does radically alter your perception and ability to understand the world. Well, regardless of what signal we're talking about, we know that the the information coming in from the senses will then be further refined by a variety of what we call association centers in the cerebrum. And there are a whole bunch of association centers, but I only want to call 4 of them to your attention. So I could be talking about 20 of them here, so you're getting lucky. We're only going to talk about 4 because they have at least some relevance to hope and religion, and we'll be talking about them from time to time. So the visual association center is something that kicks in after a sight signal is processed. The visual association center adds information from other senses like emotion and memory. And we'll talk about where those signals are processed in a few minutes. A second one in the cerebrum that's important is the orientation center. This receives information from sensations like touch, vision, and hearing. And it is very important to creating a 3D image of one's body in space. It defines the boundary between this is me, this is myself, this is not me. And so we'll find that when we talk about mysticism and prayer, that the orientation center activity goes down, suggesting that is one of the effects of deep religious communion. You lose this sense of your body operating in real space. Next up is the attention association center, which forms intentions and acts upon them. We know that damage to this area of the brain causes the loss of the ability to concentrate, also the inability to conceive a plan, to plan a future, or to carry out conceptual tasks that have multiple steps that have to be prioritized and done in sequence. That gets all mangled and screwed up when the attention center is itself injured. And lastly, the verbal conceptual association center is the part of the cerebrum that generates abstract concepts and relates those concepts to words. So this is a very human quality in the brain. Other organisms may have a verbal conceptual center, but it would not be involved in joining concepts to words. It requires a comprehensive understanding of language and also an ability to compare and contrast concepts and objects with one another. It also requires grammatical and logical functions. So it's a very higher order kind of brain compartment that is obviously very important in human functioning. And our interest in it is it seems to be essential to the development of consciousness and also the expression of consciousness through language. Okay, so 4 centers. Have a basic awareness of them, please. Now, after all that processing by the brain, coming from sensory input and then using the cerebrum to analyze it, there are a whole bunch of sort of afterthought things that can take place for any given message. One is to evoke an emotional response. If it hits you this way, it may make you cry, it may make you laugh, shout for joy. These are all possibilities. It could result in a motor response, which would involve having interneurons tell motor neurons to take an activity. Could be clapping, could be standing up, could be shouting, could be throwing something, could be running away. We don't know. A verbal response is another possibility, since we are, after all, creatures of language. And another possibility is simply to say, interesting idea. I think I'll hold on to that thought and store it in my long-term memory. And that's Scooter, the dog, barking for your listening pleasure. Okay, lastly, let's chat a little bit about the peripheral nervous system. Its basic function is to transmit signals between the central nervous system and the rest of the body. It includes both motor signals, which of course will be innervating muscles and glands telling them to do something, but also the sensory neurons that send and receive signals from the sensory organs to the central nervous system. The peripheral nervous system, which you remember includes all of the nerves which are not specifically in the brain or spinal column, is subdivided into the somatic nervous system, which controls voluntary movement to muscles, and also the other part is the autonomic nervous system, which, as you might expect, controls involuntary responses that are needed to run organs, glands, and smooth muscles. So the peripheral nervous system is really important in the sense that it's taking care of all of those functions that you don't want to have to remember to do. So all of the automatic things that go on in your body and your cells and your organs do so in part as a consequence of your peripheral nervous system. Hey, there's more divisions to know about. The autonomic nervous system, which we mentioned on the previous slide, is further subdivided into the sympathetic nervous system, which prepares the body for stressful or energetic activity. This is often known as the fight or flight response. In other words, if you get super scared, this is the part of your body that kicks into action. And it's also known as the running from the bear syndrome. So this is when you are facing some sort of really important, possibly mortal danger, like running from the bear would signify. What's going on here is your autonomic nervous system is kicking in to provide you with the physiological basis for running from that bear. So your heart rate kicks in, your respiratory rate goes way up. Things that you don't need at that moment, like gut activity, go down, including reproductive activity. When you're running from the bear, you don't need to be thinking about reproduction. So that goes away. And then, assuming that you escape from the bear and you're now resting comfortably under a tree or sitting around the campfire with your pals, then the parasympathetic nervous system, which acts in opposition to the sympathetic nervous system, kicks in, and it puts your system back to normal. It counteracts what the sympathetic nervous system has done and returns you to a state of homeostasis. Okay. Well, that's the cerebrum and all the fun stuff that it does. What about the rest of the brain? Well, let's recall that there are some other important subdivisions of the brain, and they are the cerebellum, which we'll talk about first. And that literally means the little brain, and also the medulla, which also has some very important functions and is a very old part of the brain. So starting with the cerebellum, this is part of your brain that coordinates body movement. It receives information from the cerebellum and helps your muscles and joints know how to operate in space. It does so in part by comparing information from different sources in the body and using that as a mechanism for understanding where you are. It's also the source of muscle memory. If you're a musician or a sports person, you will know this. When you practice and practice and practice, your muscles themselves take on a kind of memory, even though they're not neuronal tissue. And so this is also something that is very useful to you. The medulla, as I mentioned earlier, is basically just an extension of the spinal cord, which you see right here. If you look at a primitive organism, like a shark, what you'll see is that the medulla, and you can tell this by the color-coded body parts here, the medulla takes up a huge part of the shark brain, whereas in the human brain, it's comparatively small. In contrast, in the human brain, the cerebellum is huge. Remember, the cerebrum is huge, and this, of course, is the source of our executive function, creativity, and all that stuff. Whereas in the shark, it's relatively small. So, shark has big primitive brain, little executive brain. But it's still important in both the shark and the human. There are just a whole bunch of neurons with their cell bodies at the center of the medulla, and it too, like the larger cerebrum, is surrounded by a layer of myelin, and it is very important in the control of the autonomic nervous system and those functions you don't want to think about, the things like the breathing, the heart rate, the blood pressure, etc. So when we're talking about running from the bear, we're talking about the medulla helping the cerebrum to figure out, oops, we need to get the hell out of Dodge. Let's do it. Even though it is considered the primitive part of the brain. And lastly, we have the limbic system, which also is the so-called emotional brain, or the organs of emotion. This is found buried under the cerebrum. And like the cerebellum, it's a very old structure evolutionarily. So this thing has been around for a long time and continues to be important even in our modern age. The organs of emotion still do their thing, even though we have this really big brain and also we're in the modern world. The limbic system is divided into 4 different organs. We won't really talk much, if at all, about the thalamus or the hypothalamus, although we recognize that they are part of the limbic system. However, we will have occasion to mention the amygdala and the hippocampus fairly regularly. So the thalamus is sort of a relay station, and it can be important in a variety of different senses, but including olfaction. The hypothalamus is something that releases hormones and helps to maintain homeostasis functions around the body, including things like water balance and blood pressure. But again, we won't have occasion to bring this up probably again. I just want to make sure you know the name. The amygdala is really important in the discussion of hope and belief. It is responsible for the sensations of pleasure, also fear and sexual arousal. And it's something that we use all the time for facial recognition, without which life is truly hard. And lastly, the hippocampus is also very important. It is the place where we store our long-term memories, especially those that require learning. One of the things that gets stored there is the information that migratory animals use to find their place where they're supposed to go. And London taxi drivers, I guess the streets in London are a freaking mess. So if you're a London taxi driver, you have to memorize them all, and their hippocampi are huge because their long-term storage is taken over by trying to remember where the darn streets are. And that's all for today. Really, that's it. So see how easy that is? No big deal at all. So one more of these next time on how individual neurons work, and we'll be done with the nervous system. All right, we're out of here.